Joining us for more on that is Amina Taylor, our correspondent in London, and also Lembit Opik, former member of the British Parliament, also from the British capital. Amina, if I could start with you, what's the latest you're hearing from Downing Street?
Well, this is a third-rate soap opera, but of the highest quality in terms of intrigue, the participants, who's the bad guy, who are going to hiss and boo at. Essentially, Boris Johnson is going, but he's not going quietly. Anybody from that Parliamentary Privileges Committee who thought the former Prime Minister would go off gently into that good night are in for something of, well, a major disappointment, because having seen a forward copy of that report, Boris Johnson is not risking being embarrassed in the House of Commons. I mean, as if the man himself were still capable of shame here. We've recognized a long time ago that Boris Johnson is not about anyone else except for the career of Boris Johnson. And in this particular occasion, we've seen the lies. Let's be frank about that. First of all, he said he had no knowledge of these parties. Then he said, okay, if there were some parties, I mean, was he there? Was he not there? He believed wholeheartedly that the rules, as he understood them, were being followed. We later found out that that was so far from the truth. The Sue Gray report, which we've never seen in its unredacted glory, it was critical of some of those actions. I mean, remember, even the Prime Minister now, Rishi Sunak, was embroiled in some of that and had to pay a fine and apologize and try to move forward with this. But Boris Johnson is not cut from the same cloth. Here is a man who was thrown out of the party by his own fellow MPs. We're not talking about a putsch by Labour. His own Tory MPs recognized that he was becoming something of an embarrassing rope around their necks and pushed him to the other side. I mean, goodness, man. I mean, here is a man who is throwing his toys out the pram because he didn't get things his own way. He is casting shade and accusations at everyone in his wake. Please remember that this Privileges Committee is made up primarily of Conservative members. So the idea that it's some kind of political witch hunt against him, and not unfortunately the consequences of his own poor actions and decisions, if Boris Johnson believed that he was innocent and could fight and defend the charges laid against him, he would do so. Come in Parliament, give your side of the story, and let other parliamentarians and, more importantly, the wider public decides. Now he's recognized here in the middle of this despair may be a political opportunity. Remember, at the end of this long rambling message, which he blamed all his detractors from, you know, the left to the far right, he said, I'm stepping down from Parliament for now. For now, that's the important message there.
Lembit, what's your take on all this? This sounds like a lot of division, a lot of infighting within the ruling Conservative Party. We're seeing one Prime Minister leave, one Prime Minister come in so quickly. How is that going to affect the Conservatives in the upcoming election?
As always, Amina has given an erudite, very clear and very precise and correct analysis. Turning to your question, this is a huge problem for the Conservative Party. I was speaking to a senior Conservative 2 days ago before this happened, and he said their only chance in the next general election would be to bring Boris back as leader. Well, that's not going to happen now. And as Amina rightly said, those absolutely central words here, for now, means that Boris Johnson has not given up on politics. What he thinks is, once again, Amina described this very accurately, that he is the one who has been punished unfairly. He thinks that everybody else is in the wrong. The fundamental problem here is that the government created stupid policies about COVID that they did not follow themselves. And we know this from the record and from various leaks. And if Boris Johnson had taken a more mature attitude towards the whole thing and said something like, nobody's perfect, let's do our best over COVID, then he wouldn't be in trouble now. Fundamentally, the question that you're asking about the trouble in the Conservative Party is the question the Conservatives are asking themselves. Can they get out of a hole that they have dug for themselves? Most Conservatives privately believe that the Labour Party will have the most number of seats in British Parliament. And they actually, I think, feel that they need to have the time out to regroup. What you're seeing now is a slow disintegration of the party of government. This tends to happen in the UK after 10 to 15 years, and it's happening to the Conservatives as well. I cannot see how they can win the next election now, but I can see Boris Johnson coming back with a great big "I told you so," because he had the most successful election result in a British parliamentary election for the Conservatives since Margaret Thatcher.
And the Lembit is other, looking at it from a wider picture, are other prime ministers, Tory Conservative prime ministers, any better? I mean, Theresa May was kicked out. Liz Truss, I can't believe I remembered her name, because she was in there for so little. Is Rishi Sunak any better? His wife, a very wealthy woman, she said she would start paying tax on her income from abroad. That was kind of her, wasn't it?
Very generous of her. She is, in fact, the Prime Minister's wife, and it would have been better maybe if they'd offered to do that before it went into the national media. You mentioned Liz Truss. I have to tell you that about 30 years ago, I trained Liz Truss when she was still a student politician, and she was in the Liberal Democrats. I would never have expected her to become Prime Minister. But there's a difference between Liz Truss and Theresa May and David Cameron. They lost their positions due to political failure. Boris Johnson lost his position because he allegedly misguided Parliament. He did wrong things, not just bad things in political terms, but wrong things. But Boris Johnson, and here's the irony, Boris Johnson delivered that great election result for the Conservatives. And it doesn't seem likely, turning to the question about Rishi Sunak, that Rishi Sunak has got the charisma, the power, the common appeal that Boris Johnson had. So they've now lost their best bet for a recovery. And it seems to me that it can only really be one result for the next general election, and that's probably a Keir Starmer victory. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just thinking it's the likely thing.
Indeed, fair enough. Okay, just Amina, if I can get back to you very quickly. Boris, we keep hearing about Boris. The man just doesn't leave the headlines. Is that what the general public are interested in, or would they? I mean, we know there's the rising inflation in the UK as a direct result of the UK government's foreign policy towards Ukraine. You've got an energy crisis over there. You've got families suffering. They're struggling to put food on the table. Is that what needs to be addressed at this current time?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you? You would think that would be the actual primary aim of a government at the moment, to right some of the wrongs their fiscal policies have created, and this environment of, looking overseas whilst our own house is on fire here. But the Tories have always been about the Tories, and no one more exemplifies that than Alexander Johnson, to give him his correct name here. Because what we are looking at is a party that's more concerned looking inwards than outwards. And a minor point of disagreement with what Lembit just said there. Boris is one of the few politicians that has first name recognition with the ordinary Brits. If you go down to any street in the UK, that hair, that smile, the voice, the intonation, the name, people know who he is. And that's one of the first things parliamentarians will give their mother's eyeliner for, just to be recognized by members of the public, in the hope that when they get to that ballot box, they may put their precious X beside your name. So I'm not counting out Boris just yet. Here is a man who has done the unthinkable. I literally laughed in the face of the person who told me he was going to be London mayor, then prime minister. I guess the joke is on me.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let me thank our guests for their contribution. Amina Taylor is our reporter in London, and we also had Lembit Opik, former British Prime Minister, former member of the British Parliament.
I wish I was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
I would have given you my vote, Lembit. You'd have got my vote.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, that brings an end to another edition of the News Review.